Welcome to the Foundry, where leaders are forged daily. I'm your host, George Roberts. Welcome back, entrepreneurs. Today, we welcome Jonathan Nichols to the virtual studio. Jonathan is founder of Apogee Capital. He is a multifamily investor and an expert in short-term rentals. In addition, he is an avid runner and triathlete. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, George, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So before we get started in real estate, you were and still are, I believe, a helicopter engineer. Are there any interesting stories you can tell us about that walk of life?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So I decided I wanted to be an aerospace engineer when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I watched the movie Apollo 13 and saw all those guys in the control room doing the math and all this cool stuff. And I knew that's what I had to study. So I graduated school about 8 years ago. I've worked for a local helicopter manufacturer for those 8 years. So didn't go to rockets, went to helicopters, but had so many adventures throughout that. And I guess one that really stands out is I used to do a lot of flight testing. And one winter actually got sent to northern Canada to test a helicopter in minus 50-degree weather. So that definitely was a highlight as far as experiences in my career as an engineer.
That's awesome. Something near and dear to my heart and my family. My brother-in-law, he is actually an airplane pilot. Airplane mechanic. His brother is a pilot, and I just interviewed David Monroe, who is a helicopter mechanic of all things. So how do you like that? Aviation.
I've actually talked to David quite a bit about helicopters in the past, so that's super cool.
I love it, and obviously a tie-in with your company of Apogee Capital. You want to tell us the background behind that name?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you asking that question. So, when we started our multifamily business about a year ago this time, I was trying to think of a lot of people come up with some catchy name that ties their past or their experience, their passion to what it is that they're trying to accomplish in multifamily. And so I landed on the name Apogee Capital because if you look it up in the dictionary, it has two different meanings. First of all, in aerospace, it has the meaning of if you're talking about one body orbiting another, and that could be the moon, it could be a satellite, a rocket, whatever. Apogee is basically like the highest point that it will reach in that orbit. And so it's a term that has a lot of significance, in aerospace when we're doing calculations and stuff. But then the more general definition of it in the dictionary is basically the culmination or the climax of an achievement. And so our goal at Apogee Capital is to help investors reach their financial potential, their climax, the best that they can do financially. And so we believe that, our investments are able to help them do that. And so that's kind of the meaning behind the name.
Okay, that's awesome. And I always wonder, everybody that I know in real estate, almost everybody, they start out in some other field and they're rather successful in it. And I always wonder, I always ask the question to people who have successfully raised capital like you, were you able or successful in parlaying this experience into getting other aerospace engineers or pilots into your deal?
Well, I guess the short of it is yes. I think I can still do better than even what we've done now. But just in general, George, the thing I always tell my investors is that on a syndication team, everyone kind of has their experiences and their specialties that they bring to it. And one thing I think I bring is my engineering background. I've done a lot of analysis on helicopters, on aircraft. Certainly that brings valuable experience when you're talking about looking at numbers and such on a multifamily deal. But more than that, I think it's the ability to make very challenging and important decisions. So like when we're doing flight tests, there's times where, something isn't quite right and we have to make a call like, are we going to fly? Are we not going to fly? How are we going to handle this emergency? Experimental aircraft flight is something that definitely takes an ability to make quick decisions that have a lot of sound judgment behind them. And I think the same's true in the multifamily world. you're looking at a deal or an opportunity, you don't get to just analyze it to death for 5 years until you decide what you want to do. You have to be able to make a quick decision that's sound and that's going to come out well. And so that's something I always communicate to my investors, and certainly it has resonated with, those in the engineering field.
I love it. And when I took college physics, our professor always loved to tell us engineers save lives. And it's true, right? Sound engineering does save lives. And me coming from a background of data science, I feel like I've got a lot of those same experiences. We're making complex financial decisions all the time. Nobody lives or dies on the basis of the quality of my analysis, but it feels like that though when you get millions on the line. So, one of the things we share is a love of fitness. Now, I'm not competitive by any stretch of the imagination, but one of my general strategies for success in any field is to be fit. So I expect to have more opportunities to just step up to the plate as a result. And so I see that you are an Ironman athlete. So can you tell us what it takes to be an Ironman athlete and how that ties in with how you help veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot behind that question to sum up in a short time frame, but I've been a very active person ever since I was a kid. It's just my personality. And specifically, I started running marathons, or I ran my first marathon when I was a freshman in college, and just kept pursuing that. It's a very simple thing to go run a race, but it's not easy, right? Which is true of a lot of things in life. And so, continue to build on that skill. And then eventually, a few years ago, I switched over and do more triathlon type races now. And honestly, you asked the question about what does it take to do these types of races? And it's really one answer, and it's persistence. I was not a particularly gifted athlete as a kid. In fact, I would say I was well below average. But just that persistence over a long period of time is what changes someone from average to extraordinary. And so I think that that's kind of the big take home from running that's played off in my life, certainly in the investing arena. And so a lot of my why, the reason that, you see in the background, if you're watching the videos, I like to have some of my pictures from races I've had and a few of the medals and stuff, is because my why is running the race well. And what that means to me is that everything I do in life, it has a purpose behind it. It has a reason I'm doing it. And I don't necessarily have to be the best. There's many runners who are way better than me. There's many triathletes who are way better than me. There is and always will be investors who are way better than me. But my job is to do what I've been called to do and give it 100%. And so that's really how it plays off in my life today.
I love that. And I believe that also one tie-in with this is that you're somehow sponsoring veterans, correct?
That's correct. So, I'm a little sad to talk about this because I haven't raced now in about a year and a half due to COVID. Basically all the races a year ago were canceled. And so just starting to be training for more races. But a few years ago, shortly after I got married, my wife really challenged me. My wife's name is Paula. And she really challenged me to have a bigger purpose behind my running. Instead of just going to do races and be competitive and have fun, like she said, you need a why. And I've always had a heart for veterans. I myself am not a veteran. I don't even have very many family members that are veterans, but I just really appreciate the service. And I think a lot of the character traits of discipline, of working hard, of serving others, it really resonates well with me. And so basically I found a gentleman here in Arlington where I live who has a local veterans organization. It's called VetStarts. And the whole purpose of that organization is to help veterans returning back from service, going into the civilian world, to find their new purpose in life, whether that's going to school or a career. But his specialty is helping entrepreneur veterans. And so, I started racing a few years ago to help raise money for that organization, and look forward to doing more of that in the future now that, we kind of have COVID over with. But the truth is that it's given way back more to me than I've ever been able to give to it. So it's really been an honor to get to work with the folks there.
I just love that perspective, that humbleness that you bring. That's beautiful. And when you talk about, hey, you love being a triathlete, you don't have to be the best. This is something you love, but you want to help people reach their financial future. That reminds me so much of a panelist once, I wish I could remember the name, that got me to launch a podcast. He said, you know what? I thought about launching a podcast, and he said, the world does not need another podcast, and they definitely don't need another podcast from me. And then he said, but he realized, though, there are people in his network that will only get this message. They are only going to get this message if he goes out there and he builds that thought leadership platform. And for him and for me, that's a podcast. And I understand for you, by the way, beautiful website. I'll ask you about that in a minute. You got a blog, and you're writing those articles with your wife, Paula. And I believe you're about to launch a podcast, hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, I certainly hope to. It's on the bucket list, if you will. But the blog is kind of our media reach out to our investors right now. And I mean, really the purpose behind it, George, is the thing that made me go to real estate is the fact that it's an asset, it's an investment that I can control and I can understand. So, I spent a lot of time when I joined the work world trying to learn about 401ks and stocks and all that. But eventually I realized, one, I don't control it. And two, there's still many things I don't understand. So that's what brought me to real estate. But there's many other folks who they would like to learn, but they don't have the time to read the books. And they don't have the time to do the networking and stuff that I've been fortunate to have. And so the blog is really my attempt to give them a condensed version of what is important for a passive investor to know in a very short amount of time to read each week. So most of the blogs can be read in maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes. It's a few paragraphs type of writing. And so I've gotten a lot of feedback that's been helpful for folks that they want to passively invest, but they just need to learn a little bit more. And so as far as the website and the editing goes, all of that credit goes to my wife, Paula. She developed our website. She's the editor of the blog. So I write it each week, and then she reviews it and says, hey, this makes sense. This doesn't make sense. And then all the aesthetics she does. So we all have our skill sets. One of the skill sets that I do not have is creativity. I'm not a creative. And so she does all the aesthetics and really deserves the credit, for how the website and the blogs come out. So.
Right. And multifamily is all about team. It is great to have that sort of partner who can be the foil to you, so to speak. And I think it's beautiful that you are working with your wife. A lot of people do work with their spouses, and a lot of people, conversely, have the question, how do you get your spouse on board? So maybe you could tell us whether that was a process or maybe this came more naturally.
Yeah, so I always get that question. And truthfully, I am the worst person to answer it because for me, first of all, both of us were on board from the get-go. And about half the time I'm pushing her, and the other half of the time, maybe even 60% of the time, she's pushing me. And so, that's kind of how our relationship dynamic has gone. But, George, when we first got married, my wife wanted to have something that we could do together, some kind of hobby or something. And so, we thought about golf, and I was like, well, that's kind of boring and it's very expensive. And, we thought about running, and my wife's like, well, I don't want to run with you. That sounds miserable. And so we landed on real estate, long story short. And fortunately, it's something that we both enjoy. I think we both have skill sets that are beneficial to it, and it makes us money instead of taking money from us. So it's worked out really well. And we've kind of developed our roles that we each have over time. That's definitely an ongoing process. But as far as just the motivation and being on board, it's something that both of us are very much on board with. And so, like I said, I'm not the best person to answer the question of how to get your spouse on board with real estate.
Fair enough. So it works both ways. Sometimes it's struggles, sometimes it's more mutual. But anyway, I always hear some great responses for that. One of my favorite questions to ask.
Sure.
And certainly in terms of productivity, it beats the hell out of collecting a garage full of Lamborghinis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then, okay, so you and your wife, I believe it was 3 years ago, you developed your real estate career. You didn't start out in multifamily like most people. I think you started out with some smaller units. Tell us how that's going.
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, we first started learning about real estate. We were on a vacation a few years back and we were listening to Bigger Pockets for the first time in the car while we were driving on vacation. Okay. And there's this moment that just sticks in my head that was, in my mind, the moment I decided to become an investor. And I was listening to this show where this guy was talking about how he didn't want to be on his deathbed one day and looking back and thinking about like, what could my life have been? And that's true about anything. But certainly it should be true with our finances, with our investing, and for me personally, with potential, in business. And so that has stuck with me ever since that day. And I just realized that no matter, what the sacrifice is, I don't want to be on my deathbed, regretting not have given my best. And so long story short, we pulled the trigger and started looking for properties. Originally, we were just going to save up and buy one single family home and start renting it. And then one day my wife comes home and says, hey, we have to do this thing called a house hack, which is where we buy another property and we move there. And I was like, well, I mean, that seems kind of uncomfortable. Like, we're pretty settled here. We got a nice house. Why are we going to leave? And she's like, you don't understand. We have to do this. Like, we don't have to put down a large down payment. The interest rate's going to be better. This is exactly what we need to kickstart our real estate investing career. And I said, well, if it's what we need, I'm on board. And then obviously after I looked at the numbers and understood from a math perspective what it meant, I was really on board. And so long story short, we wound up buying a fourplex. And honestly, George, I remember we moved to the fourplex because we got a loan that required us to. That's part of what house hacking is. And needless to say, it was a downgrade from the house that we lived in. And I remember that first night laying in bed and going to sleep and realizing like, this is, if you will, the bottom of my investing career. Like, if I make through living in this place, we're going to be successful. I just have to make it through this. And we did. We actually fully renovated the place and we wound up turning it into a short-term rental, which is for folks that aren't familiar, like AirBNB, VRBO type of investing strategy. It's done extremely well. Since then, we've bought additional properties to do that with. We've started doing some arbitrage, which is where you rent and then re-rent properties on Airbnb, and it's done very well. And so certainly it's played a role in giving us that boost into the multifamily world and just our investing in general.
So I love what you call arbitrage. I come from finance. That's what I would call it. But it sounds like what you're describing could also be called sandwich lease, right? Essentially, rather than trying to take control of the property rather than to own it. And just love the margins that are available in short-term rental. I feel like I know a lot of our listeners are interested in multifamily, and I feel like that has got to be, in terms of real estate, the best sideline you could go to, or is to have, your multifamily. You've got all the advantages there, and then if you can rent out some of the units, as VRBO, Airbnb, wow, you've got it made. So, do you have any advice on that track?
Yeah, there's a few different things. I've definitely looked at sort of marrying those two worlds together. So first of all, let me just say that I totally agree with your comment about them being complementary investments. As as a multifamily syndicator, most of the GP returns comes on the sale. Not always, but a lot of it does. And so this is not a get rich quick overnight sort of thing. And with Airbnb, it's more of a cash flow heavy type of investment, particularly with the arbitrage where you don't have any equity or appreciation on the property. It's strictly a cash flow business. So I think they're very complementary in that aspect. When it comes to putting them both together, I guess the advice I can give listeners that I've learned so far is, one, any type of agency debt that you have on a property, a multifamily property, will prohibit you from being able to do that. So if you're going to purchase a property with that intent, you need to be looking for the local bank, not the agency debt. So that's one thing. Number two, you need to understand how much saturation your market can handle. So I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. We have 1 million hotels here. We have 1 million Airbnbs here. And if you added 1 million tomorrow, they would all be full. So I'm not super worried about that. But if you're someone who say you live in a smaller town or maybe an area that has seasonal travel, something like that, and you're going to put a 50-unit building on Airbnb, you might need to just put a portion of it on there or something like that. So those are kind of the two bits of advice I would give. We're actually working on a project now that's similar to that here in Arlington, and it's an 8-unit property, and so that kind of gives you an idea of where my head is as I'm thinking through things.
Yeah, I love it. Market research, number one in real estate. Everything is local. Yeah, I've seen successful Airbnbs that have been out there, but great thing to think. It was way out in Michigan, right? West Michigan. I don't know how much they're renting it out in the winter. I've got another friend who's got one in
Yeah.
Port Austin. Another beautiful place, but a place that most people wouldn't want to be in through the winter. I know another pitfall that you fall in sometimes is a lot of cities just say no. And I know in Troy, Michigan, I have a single family there. I'd like to get rid of it and put the money into something bigger, but for the moment, it's a great thing. But I can't do that because I got to operate it as a bed and breakfast, and that is just not what I do.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So, as Airbnb becomes more of a mature investment strategy, cities are receiving it in different ways. So if you go to Florida, they may tax it and they may have regulations, but they're definitely going to allow it because it has so much to do with their tourism industry, and the ability to bring money into their economy. Here in Dallas, it's kind of a 50-50 mix. It's definitely a very useful industry to have here. We have business travelers, we have tourists, specifically here in the Arlington area. But cities receive it differently, and so some cities ban it altogether. Some cities have extensive regulations and fees. So yeah, it's definitely part of the homework you have to do before signing a contract.
Yeah, I love it. And so, we've gotten this far. I think without actually going through your full history, you did mention, yeah, you started house hacking. You got the fourplex turned into short-term rental. Was there anything between that and then when you went into your commercial multifamily career?
Yeah, so I would say the first year we were investing, we dabbled in a little bit of everything. So, I have a long-term rental that's just, normal tenant, normal lease type of situation. Obviously, we did the fourplex, the short-term rental. We also did a lot of rehabs, specifically the house that we live in now, where I am now. We bought it, I would say, well below market value and did like a $45,000 rehab on it during COVID. And the way I describe it is it's kind of like the flip that we stayed and lived in,
Yeah.
because we did I think on a scale of 1 to 5, it was a 4 on difficulty. Like the only thing that could have been harder is if it was a burnout house. We did foundation, we did electrical, we did plumbing, we did, moving walls and bedrooms and sheetrock and flooring and like everything on the whole house, roof work. So, from an experience perspective, we've done a little bit of everything, but at some point you have to decide what is it that I'm going to focus on. And so the multifamily, the short-term rental is kind of where we landed. And the reason that we have both of those is the reasons that I gave earlier. So
I love it. And I love to see that progression. So let's move to your largest deal. So I understand that you did just syndicate a larger deal. I believe it's in, I want to say, Oklahoma City. Maybe you could fill us in on that.
yeah, absolutely. So you're close, but not quite. Tulsa. So just a short drive up the road, in Oklahoma, though. And so we actually did that as partners with someone that you've already interviewed on the podcast, which is Michael Barnhart and Suzy Sevier and a couple of other partners. So I was, one of the partners who worked on that deal, was definitely honored to be invited to work on that deal. Our roles really centered around, I would say, 3 things. 1, raising money for the deal. 2, being the boots on the ground. So I went up there to do the due diligence, look over the property, and was able to help in that capacity. And then a little bit with kind of the analysis and some of the underwriting stuff. So that's really where we landed on helping with that deal. But it was our first large syndication project. We closed about almost a month ago now on it. Hard to believe, and it's off to a great start. So took a long time to find the first one. It always does, but we're very happy with the choice that we made, both with the deal itself and with the partners that we've gotten to work with.
And in terms of deal size, like what was the purchase price, capital raise, number of units?
Yeah, so 100 units, purchase price 6.5 million. The raise was a little bit under 2 million, I think 1.9 or something like that. And so, Paula and I were pushing to raise $500,000, and in the end, we wound up hitting close to, not quite, $750,000. So, we were really happy with that for a first raise. It's like everything, just in the running world, right? So you go to conference or whatever, and you hear these guys that can raise $10 million in 48 hours. But for us, being a first raise, we were really happy with how it went. And so that's, it's an outstanding deal in my opinion.
Beautiful. I love that story. And by the way, if you don't know Suzy, Sevier, and Michael Barnhart, they're actually currently residing in the UK. So talk about the importance of boots on the ground. That is not investing out of state. We're talking about investing out of country. That's pretty awesome. So, I'd like to talk about or sort of speak to the investors out there who may be interested in becoming a multifamily investor. And me personally, I'm a big fan of saying, start big, but don't wait, right? And it's completely okay. If you start with, like Jonathan saying, hey, he has a straight rental, single family. He has the fourplex. He house hacked it, which, by the way, that's how Brandon Turner got his start. I think he house hacked a fourplex. This is a strategy that's tried and true. So I would say, if you're out there and you are saying like, oh my God, I haven't got the first deal, and you're thinking about giving up, even Jake and Gino, I understand, they mentioned in one of their books, I think it's Wheelbarrow Profits, they went for 6 months and they said, they gave up. Like, nobody's taking us seriously. They came back to it. And it's like your theme of persistence, right? Never give up. Most people don't win the first time, but if you stick with it, you'll win. Now, I understand you have a lot of advice for people who are new to multifamily, who are trying to break in. What would you advise somebody who might be at that point where they're feeling a little despair, not sure if they're going to get that first big deal?
Yeah, so I think there's really two answers to your question. One has to do with deciding, first of all, do you want to be active or passive? And I think we can come back to that in a moment. But the second one, if you have decided you want to be active, I had this idea a year ago that like, hey, I'm going to find this big deal right out of the bat on my own here in Dallas, very competitive market. And, basically have one other person to sign on the loan for me, and we're going to raise the money and knock it out of the park. And we worked very hard towards that goal for a year. And I guess the short answer of it is, although we've come extremely close on a few different deals here in Dallas, it's hard to get something that's a good quality deal first on your desk and then across the finish line as a new sponsor. It just has to do with relationships and credibility. So, when you're talking to a broker and you don't have a track record and they don't know you personally, it's going to be an enormous hindrance. And so I guess the long story short answer to your question is, what I tell people who are new is, whether you identify yourself as a deal finder or a capital raiser, I recommend that everyone start out raising money, because it really forces you to sort of put your money where your mouth is, get people on board with the program. And most people raising, say, $500,000 is a pretty achievable goal. Like, if you have a professional network, if you have friends and family, you can probably put that together in, say, I don't know, a 4 to 6 month time frame, and find a GP who's done a few deals, but still could use your help on the money raised, and jump in and join them. And so I honestly advise people as that be their first step into the multifamily world, because it's achievable and it gets you off and going right away. And it kind of would help with some of those disappointing feelings that you might get 9 months, 10 months, 1 year down the road when you've been looking for a deal and can't find one. And so that's the route I would go if I had to jump back a year ago.
Yeah, I love it. And for me, the first step was joining a mastermind.
Hmm.
And, we looked for 100-unit properties and above in Orlando, Florida. And it went on for
Yeah.
almost 18 months. And then one of our principals, Mark Prokop, he found a 14-unit in Orlando. Well, that was perfect, right? Because it got us out of, hey, let's wait for that first big deal. Don't wait. We got a joint venture going, and now it's onward and upward to some bigger things. So,
Absolutely. In a
so
great
I,
market.
yeah, I love it. Oh, I love it. And I love the markets that you're in too. I mean, it's just beautiful out there in Texas, Oklahoma. These are some great places to be out looking. So at this point, let's try to pivot to the final section of the interview. I want to give you an opportunity to give back to entrepreneurs. So what I would like to ask you is, first of all, like who's the biggest influence on your entrepreneurial career?
Man, that's such a hard question, because there's definitely so many people. Um, Certainly my parents, my dad specifically, they were a bit of entrepreneurs, tried a few small businesses growing up. And so that was something I definitely watched from a distance. My wife is a huge influence on me. So anyone who doesn't know her, she and her family actually immigrated here from Colombia when she was 13 years old. Basically kind of the not nothing in your pocket story, but not much either. So and now, she's a real project manager for a real estate developer, has experience as a consultant. And like I said, she's, Apogee Capital is a partnership with herself and I. And so, definitely if I had to name one person, it's probably her who's pushed me the most in this and really, encouraged me during those difficult times. Certainly there's a lot of other people from afar who have really helped out, different syndicators that are 2 or 3 steps ahead of me that have been there for me. And so all of them certainly deserve their share of that credit too.
I
So,
love it. And so I know a lot of people, their drive is probably coming to an end. All good things have to come to an end. Let's send us out with one last question. What advice, Jonathan, would you give to a new entrepreneur?
yeah, I think first of all, you have to decide is entrepreneurship for you? And maybe at this point, a new entrepreneur, they've already decided that, and that's great. But being an entrepreneurship, we have this idea, it's kind of like the 4-hour work week. I'm just gonna build this business in 2 years and spend the rest of my life at the beach. And certainly entrepreneurship and having your own business has its rewards, at least long term. But the truth is, on the short term, it is extremely difficult. That's why most people don't do it. And you have to know within yourself that, like, whatever it takes is what I'm going to do. In aerospace engineering, there's this term, and it's called escape velocity. And it's really pretty simple. It's this idea that, like, if you have a rocket and it's going up, it has to have a certain amount of speed, which is obviously produced by a certain amount of combustible or propellant in order to get out of the earth. And it can have a little bit of that propellant, a little bit of that velocity, but until it hits that number, it will not leave the Earth's orbit. And it's this idea that when you're starting a big goal, like being an entrepreneur, it's going to take an enormous amount of effort up front. And you probably don't even realize how much effort. But whatever it is, you have to be willing to put it in until you hit that escape velocity, where you can get your business moving. And that's something that people have to realize, is that it's a blank check that you're writing in order to jump into the business world and be an entrepreneur. And I think for people who it's maybe not for them, that seems overwhelming or intimidating or just something they don't want to do. But for people who it is for them, it seems exciting because it's a challenge that they can look forward to, and make a life out of it. Really enjoy the journey as they're going along. So I guess that's kind of my advice.
I love it. That is such outstanding advice. I have to say, how about this? Just one encore. How about tips for passive investors?
Yeah. So I think that everybody should be a passive investor in real estate. I know that's kind of a bit of a bold statement, but without spending an hour talking about all the advantages, which I'm sure your listeners have heard before, um, Passively investing is the ultimate way to invest. It requires minimal risk on the part of the investor, minimal responsibility, and the returns that you get from it are much higher when you combine cash flow, appreciation, equity, and tax savings than any other investment that you're going to pursue. Also, from a risk perspective, I believe the risk is much lower when your money is placed with a solid syndicator that has high integrity and a good track record. And so, I guess the thing that I would recommend to passive investors is become educated in the investment. You don't have to be a world expert, but knowing a little bit goes a long way when determining which passive investment is right for you, and being able to sleep at night knowing that your money's in good place. So that's kind of what I would tell anyone that's interested in going the passive investing route.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And just to steal from podcast number 13, Cody Laughlin says, be an active passive investor.
Sure.
And so I have to send you all out now. Thank you, Jonathan, for an inspiring and informative interview.
Absolutely, George. Thanks for having me on.